The afternoon tea was served at precisely 4 o'clock, as Margaret assured Miss Marple was the custom at Thornfield Manor. The drawing-room had grown cooler, and Mrs. Pemberton, the cook, had seen fit to light the fire despite the relatively mild weather. Miss Marple found this detail interesting. It suggested a household that believed in maintaining certain standards regardless of necessity, or perhaps one where the mistress's moods dictated such decisions. Anne Hargrove appeared with the tea service, moving through the room with the practiced invisibility of the long-term paid companion. She was indeed pale, as Margaret had mentioned, with mousy brown hair drawn back severely in the sort of perpetually anxious expression that spoke of someone who had learned never to presume too much. As she poured, Miss Marple observed the faintest tremor in her hands, and the way her eyes flickered toward the door whenever a sound came from the corridor beyond. "Anne, is everything quite all right?" Miss Marple asked gently. "You seem somewhat distressed." Anne's cheeks flushed crimson. "I'm perfectly well, thank you, Miss Marple. Just a bit tired. I didn't sleep particularly well last night." Margaret was studying a letter that had been placed beside her teacup, and she did not look up as Anne made her excuses and departed. The letter bore a London postmark, and whatever its contents, they seemed to have darkened Margaret's already complicated mood. "Difficulties?" Miss Marple ventured, turning her attention to a cucumber sandwich. "My solicitor," Margaret said, folding the letter precisely. "There are certain matters regarding the estate that require attention. Nothing that would interest you, I'm certain. Rather tedious legal business." It was the sort of deflection that Miss Marple had learned to recognize as deliberate misdirection. She had spent nearly a lifetime observing how people lied, not with obvious falsehoods, but with strategic silences and careful redirections. Margaret had told her nothing at all, really, which meant there was something about the letter that Margaret did not wish to discuss. Miss Marple filed this observation away with the same methodical precision with which she organized her sewing basket. "I imagine estate matters are quite complex," Miss Marple said conversationally, "particularly when there are multiple family members with interests in the outcome. I have found that in villages such as my own, disputes over property and inheritance often lie beneath even the most carefully maintained facades of civility." Margaret set down her teacup with a deliberate click against the saucer. "You are remarkably perceptive, Miss Marple. Has anyone ever told you that?" "I'm merely observant," Miss Marple replied. "One notices things, you see, when one reaches a certain age and has had sufficient time to study human nature. People are, on the whole, rather predictable. They repeat the same patterns of behavior, the same mistakes, generation after generation. It's rather like embroidery, actually. Once you understand the basic stitches, you can predict where the pattern will go next." Before Margaret could respond, David Ashford appeared in the doorway. He was dressed for travel, his coat spotted with rain despite the clear afternoon, and his expression suggested he had arrived in some haste. He was handsome, as his photograph had suggested, but there was something about his handsomeness that seemed temporary, as though it might dissolve at any moment beneath the weight of something darker beneath the surface. "Mother," he said, nodding curtly to Margaret before noticing Miss Marple. His entire demeanor changed fractionally. "I didn't realize you had a visitor." "David, darling. This is Miss Marple, an old friend from St. Mary Mead. She's come to stay with us for a fortnight. Miss Marple, my son, David." David performed the necessary courtesies, but his attention had already returned to his mother. There was something urgent in his bearing, something that made the air in the drawing-room seem suddenly electric with tension. "Might I speak with you privately?" he asked Margaret. "It's rather important." Margaret's composure, which had been so carefully maintained throughout the afternoon, seemed to crack slightly. "Surely whatever you have to say can wait until after dinner. I've only just welcomed Miss Marple and—" "It won't wait," David said, and there was something almost desperate in his tone. "Please, Mother. It's urgent." Margaret rose with evident reluctance, offering Miss Marple an apologetic smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I'm terribly sorry. Family business, I'm afraid. Will you excuse me? Anne can show you to your room if you'd like to rest before dinner." Miss Marple watched them leave, observing the way David's hand had trembled as he held the door open for his mother, and the way Margaret's shoulders had straightened as though she were bracing herself for something unpleasant. She remained in the drawing room alone, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm, her mind working through the layers of tension that seemed to permeate Thornfield Manor like dampness in a neglected room. The household, she reflected, was a pressure cooker. Victor's barely concealed hostility, Anne's nervous anxiety, David's desperate urgency, and Margaret's increasingly frayed composure all suggested that something beneath the surface was approaching its breaking point. In Miss Marple's experience, such pressure could only be relieved in one of two ways, either through honest confrontation or through catastrophe. As the afternoon light began to fade and the shadows in the drawing room grew longer, she found herself hoping it would not be the latter. Though of course, she thought ruefully, such hopes were rarely granted when one found oneself in a house so full of secrets. The dinner at Thornfield Manor was a study in strained civility. The dining room, with its heavy oak panelling and portraits of stern-faced ancestors, seemed to press inward on the assembled company. Miss Marple sat at Margaret's right hand, as was proper for an honoured guest, while David occupied the seat to his mother's left. Victor had been placed at the far end of the table, a positioning that Miss Marple recognized as Margaret's subtle assertion of authority. Anne Hargrove sat between Victor and the empty chair where the butler, Morrison, would have sat had Thornfield been grand enough to warrant a full dining staff. Instead, Mrs. Pemberton's daughter, Violet, a sturdy girl of perhaps 20, served the courses with competent if ungraceful efficiency. The soup course had been consumed in near silence, broken only by the occasional request to pass the salt or the bread. Miss Marple noted that David had barely touched his food, his fork moving from plate to mouth with mechanical precision, while his mind clearly occupied itself elsewhere. Margaret, by contrast, ate with deliberate focus, as though the act of consuming food required her complete concentration. Victor, however, seemed determined to ignore the general atmosphere of unease, commenting loudly on the quality of the wine and the state of the east pasture. "The tenant farmer has let things go to seed," Victor announced, gesturing with his fork. "I've spoken to him twice about it, but the man seems determined to allow the property to deteriorate. Margaret really ought to consider whether his lease is worth renewing. The Hendersons have farmed that land for 30 years. Margaret said quietly, "I see no reason to disrupt an arrangement that has served us well simply because a few fields look less than pristine. An arrangement that serves them well, you mean," Victor corrected, his mustache bristling. "They're hardly paying what the land is worth in today's market. If we're to maintain the estate properly, we must be willing to make difficult decisions." David set down his fork with a sharp clink against his plate. "Perhaps not all decisions need to be made based on pure profit, Uncle Victor." Victor's face reddened. "And what would you know about it, boy? You've been away for 5 years, squandering time in London and abroad. You've no idea what it takes to manage a property of this size." "I know that people matter," David said, his voice low and controlled in a way that suggested considerable effort. "I know that loyalty and decency matter. Not everything can be reduced to ledgers and quarterly returns." "Idealism," Victor snorted. "The luxury of those who don't bear the responsibility for maintaining anything." Miss Marple observed this exchange with the detached interest of someone watching a carefully choreographed dance whose steps had been repeated so many times that the dancers no longer needed to think about them. This was an old argument between these two, rehearsed and refined through years of repetition. What was new, however, was the particular venom with which Victor delivered his usual criticisms and the unusual defense that David mounted. Normally, Miss Marple suspected, David would have simply withdrawn, conceding the field to his uncle's bluster. Something had changed. Violet appeared with the next course, and the conversation shifted awkwardly to safer territory. Margaret inquired about Miss Marple's journey, which led to a discussion of train schedules and the relative merits of the Cotswold countryside versus Sussex coast. Victor contributed occasional remarks about property values in various regions, clearly unable to abandon his favorite subject entirely. David said very little, pushing his roasted pheasant around his plate with increasing disinterest. It was as the dessert course was being cleared that the electricity in the room seemed to intensify. Margaret had risen to suggest they withdraw to the drawing-room for coffee when there came a sharp knock at the dining-room door. Mrs. Pemberton entered, her face flushed and agitated in a way that suggested something quite out of the ordinary had occurred. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Ashford," she said breathlessly, "but there's been an accident in the study. Mr. Ashford, that is, the elder Mr. Ashford, your late husband's study, there's been an accident." The colour drained from Margaret's face. "What sort of accident? What are you talking about?" "I was cleaning in there not 20 minutes past," Mrs. Pemberton continued, her words tumbling over one another in her distress, "and I found the old compass. You know, the one that's always sat on the writing table. It's been moved and there's water everywhere. I think perhaps someone's had a fall, ma'am. The floor is wet, and there's been broken glass and—" But Margaret was already moving toward the door, with David close behind her. Victor rose more slowly, his earlier bluster seemingly deflated. Miss Marple observed all of this with her characteristic stillness, though her mind was processing the implications of what Mrs. Pemberton had said with considerable speed. A compass moved from its accustomed position, water on the floor, broken glass. These were not the sorts of details that emerged from a simple fall. These were the sorts of details that suggested deliberate disturbance, careful rearrangement. Miss Marple set down her napkin with deliberate precision and followed. The others toward the study, her knitting needles forgotten on her chair. The study door stood open, and even from the corridor, Miss Marple could see the evidence of disorder. But it was what she noticed in the moment, before Margaret gasped, and David swore softly under his breath, that truly captured her attention. On the Persian rug, partially obscured by shadow, lay a leather shoe, a man's shoe, expensive and well-maintained, of the sort that only one person in Thornfield Manor would have worn. The shoe was still attached to its owner, though Victor Ashford himself would never wear anything again. The study descended into controlled chaos in the moments that followed. Margaret had sunk into the nearest chair, one trembling hand pressed to her mouth, while David stood frozen in the doorway, his face draining of colour as the full reality of what lay before them registered. Mrs. Pemberton had begun to cry quietly in the corridor, her earlier agitation transformed into something more primal and genuine. It was Miss Marple who, with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to crisis, took charge of the immediate situation. "Mrs. Pemberton, please go to the kitchen and put on the kettle," she said gently but firmly. "Make some strong tea. Everyone will need it. David, would you be so kind as to telephone the police from the drawing-room? The village constable first, I think, and then whoever oversees these matters in the county. We mustn't disturb anything here until they've arrived." David nodded mechanically, as though grateful for the instruction, and disappeared down the corridor. Mrs. Pemberton, similarly relieved to have a purpose, hurried away toward the kitchen. This left Miss Marple alone with Margaret and the body of Victor Ashford, who lay on his back beside the mahogany writing desk, his face frozen in an expression of surprise. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to examine the scene without moving closer. The old compass that Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned lay on the desk itself, several feet from where it would have logically fallen. The water that had so alarmed the housekeeper was indeed present, though upon closer inspection, Miss Marple saw that it formed a specific pattern around the body, rather than having been spilled randomly. Broken glass, a tumbler she presumed, lay scattered near Victor's outstretched hand. His face bore no visible marks of violence, and there was no blood visible on the carpet, which Miss Marple found particularly noteworthy. "How dreadful," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "How absolutely dreadful. This will be the end of everything, you know. The scandal, the questions. Thornfield will never recover from this." Miss Marple pulled a chair closer to Margaret and sat down, regarding her old friend with the careful attention she might have given to an unravelling piece of needlework. "My dear, I understand this is shocking, but perhaps we might consider the circumstances before we catastrophize the consequences. Tell me, when did you last see your brother-in-law before this evening?" Margaret's eyes focused on Miss Marple with some difficulty, as though pulling her attention back from some distant place of horror. "This afternoon, I suppose. He was looking for me in the drawing-room, as you may recall. After that, I saw him at dinner, and then we rose to leave, and Mrs. Pemberton came in with her terrible news. And during dinner he seemed quite as usual, argumentative with David, opinionated about the estate. Yes, exactly as he always was, Margaret corrected herself, wincing at the tense change. Loud and overbearing, nothing out of the ordinary, except perhaps that David engaged with him more directly than usual. They exchanged some sharp words, but nothing remarkable. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind working through the details with practiced efficiency. There were several things about this scene that troubled her, though she could not yet articulate precisely why. The positioning of the body suggested that Victor had been standing when he fell, which would be consistent with a heart attack or a stroke. Yet the compass's displacement and the arrangement of the water seemed to suggest something more deliberate than simple accident or natural cause. Anne Hargrove appeared in the doorway, her pale face even more colorless than usual. "Margaret, I heard something dreadful has happened. Is there anything I can—" She stopped, seeing the body, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Anne, perhaps you might sit with Margaret for a moment," Miss Marple suggested. "She's had quite a shock, and I'm certain your company would be a comfort." Anne moved obediently to Margaret's side, taking her employer's hand with the familiarity of long service. There was something in the gesture that interested Miss Marple, a depth of concern that seemed to exceed the normal bounds of professional duty. She filed this observation away, as she had filed so many others. David returned to the study, his face grim. "The police are on their way. The constable said they'd be here within 30 minutes. There's a detective from the county town who can arrive within the hour." "Thank you, David," Miss Marple said. "That was very efficient. I wonder if you might do one more thing for me. Could you find Violet and ensure that she remains in the kitchen with her mother? I think it would be best if everyone were accounted for while we wait." David looked at her curiously, as though surprised by her assumption of authority in this crisis. "Of course. Will you stay here?" "I think someone should," Miss Marple replied, "to ensure that nothing is disturbed before the proper authority." Arrive. As David departed on this errand, Miss Marple settled herself in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her sharp blue eyes taking in every detail of the study. The old compass on the desk caught the light, its brass surface gleaming. She found herself wondering why it had been moved at all. Compasses, in her experience, were not the sort of objects that people typically disturb during the commission of a crime, unless, of course, there was a very specific reason for doing so. The wind rattled the study windows, and somewhere in the distance, Miss Marple could hear the sound of an approaching motor car. The police would arrive soon, and with them would come questions, investigations, and the inevitable machinery of official procedure. But Miss Marple had already begun to suspect that there were questions far more subtle and complex than those the police would think to ask. She looked at Victor's still face and wondered what secrets died with him. Inspector Thornton arrived at Thornfield Manor with the methodical precision of a man who had investigated countless deaths and had developed a systematic approach to each one. He was tall and lean, with iron-grey hair and the kind of observant eyes that missed very little, though Miss Marple suspected they missed rather more than they perceived. He was accompanied by a younger constable and a police surgeon, Dr. Hastings, who set about his examination of Victor Ashford's body with professional detachment. The inspector had commandeered the drawing room for his initial interviews, requiring each member of the household to account for their movements in the hour preceding the discovery of the body. Margaret had been questioned first, her story straightforward enough. She had been with Miss Marple throughout the afternoon and early evening until summoned to dinner. David had been questioned next, his narrative some hat more complicated, involving a private conversation with his mother and several solitary hours in his room before joining the family for dinner. When Anne Hargrove's turn came, Miss Marple observed from her seat by the window how the inspector's questions seemed to sharpen slightly. Anne had been in her small room on the second floor, she claimed, organizing correspondence and preparing Margaret's schedule for the following week. No one could verify this, as she had been alone. The inspector made a note of this, his pen scratching against his notebook with an audible sound that seemed to make Anne even more nervous than she already was. Victor's movements were more difficult to establish. Mrs. Pemberton reported that she had seen him in the study at approximately 4 o'clock, sitting at the desk with papers spread before him. She had offered to tidy the room, but he had dismissed her curtly, as was his habit. No one else claimed to have seen him between that time and the discovery of his body at approximately 6:30. Inspector Thornton conducted his interviews with practiced courtesy, but Miss Marple detected an underlying assumption in his questions that suggested his mind was already moving toward a conclusion. When he finally approached her, his manner became almost deferential, the respect one professional grants to another who operates in a similar sphere of observation and deduction. "Miss Marple, I understand you've only just arrived at Thornfield this morning," he began, settling into the chair opposite her. "Yet I'm told that you were present throughout the afternoon and that you accompanied the family through dinner. Perhaps you might offer some observations about the household dynamics." "I'm afraid I can offer very little of consequence," Miss Marple replied, with the self-deprecating modesty that had served her so well throughout her long life. "I merely a visitor, after all, though I confess I have observed that Mr. Victor Ashford seemed to be a man of rather strong opinions, particularly regarding the management of the estate. Strong opinions that he was not shy about expressing, I take it. Precisely so. Though I would venture to suggest that such opinions, when passionately held, sometimes mask deeper anxieties. Mr. Ashford seemed to me to be a man genuinely concerned about the estate's prosperity, even if his methods of expressing that concern were somewhat abrasive." Inspector Thornton leaned back in his chair, studying her with an interest that suggested he was reassessing his initial dismissal of her as merely another elderly guest. "And the other members of the household? How would you characterize their relationships with the deceased?" Margaret, Mrs. Ashford, seemed fond of her brother-in-law, if somewhat exasperated by his manner. David appeared to tolerate him with the patience one extends to a necessary relation, though I sensed some friction between them this evening at dinner. Anne Hargrove seemed anxious in his presence, as though she feared provoking his displeasure. As for the servants, I formed no particular impression. The inspector made notes, his expression thoughtful. "You're quite observant for someone who claims to offer little of consequence, Miss Marple. One reaches a certain age and develops habits of observation," she replied with a gentle smile. "It's really quite automatic, rather like how you no doubt observe far more than you consciously realize about the people you meet." After the inspector released her, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to her room, ostensibly to rest. In reality, she spent the next hour sitting by her window, watching as Dr. Hastings emerged from the study and conferred quietly with the inspector. Their body language suggested a preliminar. Why conclusion had been reached. It was not until after 10 o'clock that evening, when the household had been instructed to retire and the police had finally withdrawn to the village, that Anne Hargrove appeared at Miss Marple's door with a cup of tea. Her hands trembled as she offered it, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Thank you, Anne," Miss Marple said gently. "Won't you sit for a moment? You look quite distressed." Anne hesitated, then sank into the chair by the window. For several minutes she said nothing, simply staring out at the dark gardens beyond. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you notice anything this afternoon before dinner? Anything unusual?" Miss Marple regarded her young friend carefully. "I noticed that you were anxious, more anxious than usual. I noticed that you seemed to be listening for something, or perhaps someone. And I noticed that when David Ashford arrived, you seemed relieved, as though his presence provided you some measure of reassurance." She paused, allowing the silence to stretch between them. "Why do you ask, Anne?" "Because," Anne said, her voice cracking slightly, "I'm afraid the inspector is going to blame David, and I'm afraid that if David is blamed, no one will ever know the truth about what actually happened in that study." "And do you know the truth?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Anne's eyes filled with tears. "I know enough to know that it's far more complicated than anyone will believe." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care, giving herself a moment to consider her response. In her experience, confessions were delicate things, requiring patience and a careful balance between encouragement and restraint. Anne Hargrove was clearly teetering on the precipice of revelation, and one wrong word might send her tumbling back into silence. "Tell me, Anne," Miss Marple said finally, "why you believe the inspector will blame David." Anne twisted her hands together in her lap, her pale fingers working against one another as though they were independent of her will. Because David was arguing with Victor at dinner, because David has been in financial difficulties, I've seen the letters from his creditors, because David stands to inherit a considerable sum from Margaret's will, and Victor has been insisting that Margaret change the provisions to protect his own financial interests in the estate. She drew a shaky breath. The inspector will see all of that and conclude that David had motive and opportunity. He won't look any deeper than that. But you believe there is more to see, Miss Marple prompted gently. "I know there is," Anne said with sudden vehemence. "I've worked in this house for 5 years, Miss Marple. I see things. I hear things. The conversations that happen when people think the servants aren't listening, the letters that arrive in the post, the telephone calls made after midnight when everyone else is supposedly asleep." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her posture conveying attentive interest without judgment. "What sorts of things have you observed, Anne? Specifically, regarding Mr. Victor Ashford?" Anne hesitated, her resolve seeming to waver. "I shouldn't be telling you any of this. It's not my place. Margaret has been kind to me, and David—" She stopped abruptly, color flooding her pale cheeks. "David is important to you," Miss Marple observed, "not unkindly. He's kind," Anne said quietly. "He treats servants as though they're human beings rather than furniture. He noticed when I was ill last winter, and brought me books from London without being asked. When Victor was particularly cruel about some mistake I made, David defended me. He's a good man, and I won't see him hanged for something he didn't do." "Then you must tell me what you know," Miss Marple said. "Not because I ask you to betray confidences, but because the truth, however complicated, is ultimately the only thing that can protect an innocent man." Anne rose and moved to the door, checking the corridor beyond before returning to her seat. When she spoke again, her voice was so low that Miss Marple had to strain to hear her. 3 weeks ago, I was in the library when Margaret and Victor had a terrible row. They didn't know I was there. I was shelving books and they came in through the side door. Victor was demanding that Margaret sign some documents regarding the estate's finances. He said the property was in worse condition than anyone realized, that debts had accumulated, that without immediate intervention, the entire inheritance would be depleted within a decade. Anne paused, gathering courage. Margaret refused. She said that Victor had mismanaged his own finances through poor judgment and speculation, and she wouldn't allow him to control hers. "And this was a significant disagreement?" Miss Marple asked. Victor was furious. He said that Margaret had always been foolish with money, that she'd squander everything on sentiment and loyalty to people who didn't deserve it. He said that if she wouldn't listen to reason, he would take matters into his own hands. He mentioned something about speaking to a lawyer, about exploring whether there were legal remedies available to him as a family member with vested interests in the estate. Miss Marple processed this information carefully. That would suggest that Mr. Ashford was considering some form of legal action against his sister-in-law. "Did you hear anything more specific?" "Not then," Anne said. "But last week I was in Margaret's study when she received a telephone call. It was her solicitor. He said that Victor had made inquiries about challenging the validity of our will on the grounds of mental incompetence. He wanted to know if there was any basis for such a claim. Margaret told him there was absolutely no basis whatsoever, and that if Victor pursued such a course of action, she would take legal steps against him for harassment and defamation. The picture was becoming clearer in Miss Marple's mind, though she was careful to keep her expression neutral. And what of David? Where does he fit into these tensions? David came home last week, and Margaret told him about Victor's threats. I heard them talking in the library. David became quite angry. Angrier than I've ever seen him. He said that Victor was a bully and a parasite, that he had no right to threaten Margaret, that if Victor wouldn't stop, David would make him stop. He said, Anne's voice trembled, he said he would do whatever was necessary to protect their mother. Those are strong words, Miss Marple observed. I know, Anne said miserably. which is precisely why the inspector will interpret them as a threat, why he'll believe that David acted on those words. But you don't believe that. No, Anne said firmly, because this afternoon when David arrived at Thornfield, he had tea with Margaret in her sitting room. I was bringing fresh water for her flowers, and I heard them talking. David told her that he'd had a meeting with a financial advisor. He said that he'd received a substantial investment opportunity from an old friend in London, and if it proceeds as planned, he'll be able to resolve his own financial difficulties within 6 months. He told Margaret that he was sorry for the burden he'd placed on her, that he wouldn't need her help after all. Miss Marple felt a piece of the puzzle shift into place. And what did Margaret say to this? She wept, Anne said softly. She told David that she'd never seen his difficulties as a burden, that she loved him, regardless, and that she was proud of him for trying to resolve matters himself. Anne's eyes filled with tears again. It was a lovely conversation. It was the opposite of what someone would have before committing murder. Indeed, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. She rose and placed a gentle hand on Anne's shoulder. You've been very brave to tell me this, Anne. Now, I have one more question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. This afternoon, after Mrs. Pemberton found the body but before the police arrived, did you notice anything unusual about the study itself? Any detail that seemed out of place? Anne frowned, considering. The compass, she said finally. The old brass compass that sits on the desk. It was facing a different direction than it usually does. I'm quite certain of it, because I dust that desk every morning, and the compass always points north. This evening it was pointing south. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Thank you, Anne. That detail is more important than you might realize. Now, I think you should return to your room and try to sleep. Tomorrow will bring new developments, I suspect, and you'll need your rest. After Anne left, Miss Marple sat alone in her room, her mind working through the accumulated details like a spider constructing a web, a compass deliberately reversed. Victor's financial desperation masked beneath bluster, David's sudden financial optimism, Anne's protective devotion. And somewhere beneath it all, a truth that was far more intricate and sinister than anyone had yet suspected. She picked up her knitting needles and resumed work on her pale blue cardigan, her hands moving with practiced precision while her mind continued its relentless pursuit of understanding. The morning sun illuminated Thornfield Manor with cruel clarity, stripping away the shadows that had provided some mercy during the night. Miss Marple had slept little, her mind too occupied with the accumulating contradictions to permit rest. She had risen early and taken a solitary breakfast in her room, requesting that a pot of tea be sent up, rather than joining the household. At 8:30, she made her way downstairs to find the house in a state of controlled disturbance. Inspector Thornton had returned with a constable and a photographer, and the study had been cordoned off pending the completion of the preliminary investigation. Dr. Hastings's preliminary report, delivered in the drawing room where Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, suggested that Victor had died of acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack, in plain language. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of poisoning, and no evidence of foul play. The broken glass appeared to have resulted from Victor's fall, and the water on the floor likely came from a carafe that had stood on the desk. It appears to have been a natural death, Inspector Thornton explained, though his tone suggested he was not entirely satisfied with this conclusion. Unfortunate, certainly, but not criminal. Mr. Ashford's medical history, as provided by his London physician, indicates he had suffered from hypertension and had been warned about excessive stress. It would seem the argument at dinner may have precipitated the attack. Margaret's face had gone very still upon hearing this. So there will be no further investigation. We'll complete our formalities, of course, the inspector said, but unless the post-mortem examination reveals something unexpected, I believe we can conclude that Mr. Ashford's death was due to natural causes. After the inspector had withdrawn to confer with his colleagues, Miss Marple found herself alone with Margaret in the drawing room. The older woman sat rigidly in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests as she feared she might otherwise float away. "Are you quite all right?" Miss Marple asked gently, settling into the chair beside her friends. I should be relieved, Margaret said, her voice hollow. Shouldn't I? A natural death means no scandal, no investigation into family secrets, no trial. David is safe. Everything should be as it was. But it isn't, Miss Marple observed. No, Margaret agreed. It most certainly is not. You see, Miss Marple, I am not the foolish woman that Victor believed me to be. I understood perfectly well what he was doing with his financial schemes and his legal threats. I understood that he was desperately frightened, that the losses he'd accumulated through speculation had left him facing ruin. She paused, her jaw tightening. I also understood that he was planning to move against David. Move against him how? Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew. Victor had discovered something about David's past, something from his time abroad, that David had hoped to keep hidden. Victor was going to use it to gain leverage over me, to force my compliance with his financial demands. He told me as much during our confrontation last week. He said that if I didn't sign over control of certain assets, he would ensure that David's secret became public knowledge, that it would ruin David's life and prospects. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And what was this secret? Margaret hesitated for a long moment, clearly warring with herself about what could be disclosed. Finally, she said quietly, David had become involved with a woman abroad, a woman who was already married. When her husband discovered the affair, there was a scandal. David left the country rather than face the consequences, but the scandal followed him in correspondence and rumor. It could have been managed, given time and discretion, but in Victor's hands, it would have been weaponized. So David knew of Victor's intentions. Yes, Anne must have told you as much, though I shouldn't be angry with her for it. She was trying to protect David, which shows the goodness of her heart. David and I discussed the situation at length yesterday. He was desperate, Miss Marple. Not desperate enough to commit murder. David hasn't it in him to harm anyone, but desperate enough to consider running away again, to putting himself beyond Victor's reach. And then Victor died, Miss Marple said softly. And then Victor died, Margaret echoed. Of a heart attack brought on by stress and his own failing health. The universe has its own form of justice, it seems. Miss Marple sat with this revelation, allowing the pieces to arrange themselves in her mind. The financial desperation, the threats, the family tensions, all of it was real, and yet none of it had directly caused Victor's death. And yet something continued to trouble her about the scene in the study, the compass particularly. Compasses were not objects that moved themselves, and they were certainly not objects that typically became reversed during the course of a heart attack. Margaret, Miss Marple said carefully, I have a question, and I would very much appreciate an honest answer. When you were in the study this afternoon, after Victor first mentioned his intentions toward David, what precisely transpired? Margaret's face drained of color. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Miss Marple said gently but firmly. I think you went to the study to confront Victor. I think there was an altercation, perhaps physical. I think something happened that has nothing to do with the cause of his death, but which you have been protecting. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. Then, with the air of someone laying down a burden she could no longer carry, she began to speak. I went to the study at 4 o'clock, yes. I intended to tell him that if he breathed a word of David's past to anyone, I would see him prosecuted for extortion and fraud. I was angry, Miss Marple, more angry than I've been in decades. Margaret's hands trembled as she continued. Victor became defensive and then aggressive. He said that I was ungrateful, that he had sacrificed everything for this family, that David was a disappointment and a disgrace. He said he had every right to use whatever leverage he could find. And then I told him to leave. I told him to pack his things and remove himself from Thornfield. He refused. He became quite violent in his language, and I'm ashamed to say I matched his fury. We argued, and in the heat of the moment, I picked up the compass from the desk and I threw it at him. It struck him on the shoulder. He lunged toward me, clearly intending to strike me back, and then he simply stopped. He clutched his chest and fell. Margaret's voice had become barely audible. I should have called for help immediately. But for a moment, just a moment, I stood there and did nothing. I stood there and I was glad. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Miss Marple? I was glad that he was dying, glad that the threat to my son was ending. That makes me a monster, doesn't it? No, Miss Marple said quietly. It makes you human. You did call for help eventually? Yes. After perhaps 30 seconds of shock, I came to my senses and rang for Mrs. Pemberton. I told her to fetch the doctor and to call for help. But those 30 seconds, Miss Marple, I shall never forgive myself for those 30 seconds. Miss Marple reached out and took Margaret's hand. My dear, I think you should understand something. Victor Ashford did not die because you threw a compass at him. A compass would not have triggered a fatal heart attack in a man whose heart was sound. Victor died because his heart was already failing, because his stress and his desperate circumstances had taken their physical toll. You may have startled him, you may have provoked an emotional response, but you did not kill him. He was dying already. He simply didn't know it. But the inspector, if he knew about the argument, about the compass, the inspector will not know, unless you choose to tell him, Miss Marple said firmly. The compass is now back on the desk, facing south instead of north because you were agitated when you threw it. That is all. A detail of no consequence to anyone but us. The morning progressed with the peculiar weight that follows tragedy, even when that tragedy has been officially deemed accidental. Inspector Thornton completed his interviews with a sense of professional duty rather than investigative urgency, and by mid-afternoon he had effectively closed the inquiry. Victor Ashford would be remembered as a man whose heart had simply given out, hastened perhaps by stress and long-standing health conditions, but ultimately a victim of his own mortal limitations, rather than any external malice. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the day in quiet observation, her knitting providing the perfect cover for her continued contemplation. She had resolved, during her conversation with Margaret, that the truth as she understood it would remain between them. Victor's secret confrontation with his sister-in-law was irrelevant to the facts of his death, and disclosing it would only create additional suffering for those who had already endured enough. Sometimes, she had learned through decades of experience, the purpose of investigation was not to expose every truth, but to understand the ones that mattered. Yet there remained one detail that continued to trouble her, a single thread that did not quite fit into the tapestry of events as they had been presented. It was a small thing, almost trivial, but Miss Marple had learned never to dismiss such inconsistencies. She found herself returning again and again to Anne Hargrove's observation about the compass's reversed direction. At 4 o'clock, as the autumn light began its descent toward evening, Miss Marple requested a private word with Anne in the library. The young woman arrived looking anxious, clearly uncertain whether Miss Marple's invitation portended praise or reproach for having confided in her the previous evening. "Anne, I hope you're not troubled by our conversation last night," Miss Marple began gently. "You did the right thing in speaking to me. It took considerable courage, and I want you to know that I recognized it as such." Anne's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I was afraid you might think me disloyal to Margaret. Not at all. On the contrary, your loyalty to both Margaret and David is evident and admirable. I did want to ask you something, however, something that you mentioned rather in passing. You said that the compass on the study desk was facing a different direction than usual." "Yes," Anne confirmed. "I dust that desk every morning without fail. The compass always points north toward the window. Yesterday evening when we discovered the body, it was pointing south, toward the wall. It was the first thing I noticed, actually, before I even saw Mr. Ashford lying there." "And you're quite certain of this?" "Absolutely certain. It struck me as odd, though I suppose it was hardly the most significant oddity of the moment. I didn't mention it to the inspector because I was already so distressed, and it seemed so trivial compared to everything else." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Tell me, when you dusted the desk yesterday morning, did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Ashford? Did he seem unwell or distressed?" Anne considered this carefully. "He was in the study when I went in to dust, actually. He was working through some papers and seemed quite ordinary. Perhaps a bit irritable, but that was hardly unusual for him. He did send me away quite sharply, saying he didn't want to be disturbed. So I left and didn't return until much later in the afternoon. And when you did return, was the door locked? No, I don't think so. Why do you ask? Merely curious, Miss Marple said. Anne, I wonder if you would do something for me. It's rather an odd request, but I would be grateful. Would you show me precisely how the compass was positioned when you usually dust it? And then show me how it was positioned last evening when you discovered the body? Anne looked puzzled but willing. She led Miss Marple to the study, where the compass still remained on the mahogany desk, though the police photographer's markers and the chalk outline that had briefly marked Victor's position had been removed. The study felt different now, drained of the shock and horror that had filled it the previous evening. It was merely a room again, though perhaps a room with memories attached to it. Anne carefully turned the compass U, until it pointed toward the east window. It normally faces this direction, she explained, toward the light. I've always assumed that was how Mr. Ashford preferred it, because it was never moved. And when you discovered the body... Anne reversed the compass, so it pointed toward the interior wall. It was like this, pointing almost directly away from where it usually points. Miss Marple studied the compass with particular attention. It was a handsome object, early Victorian perhaps, made of brass with an ornate face and detailed markings. The needle was well maintained, clearly moved regularly enough that it responded smoothly to gentle repositioning. It was exactly the sort of object that would catch the light during a fall, that might be knocked aside by a tumbling body, and yet... Anne, Miss Marple said slowly, if Mr. Ashford had collapsed suddenly, as would happen with a heart attack, the compass would have been knocked over, or perhaps struck aside. But the compass is still standing upright on the desk. It hasn't fallen at all. Anne's eyes widened as she understood the implication. Someone moved it deliberately. Almost certainly, Miss Marple agreed. The question is why, and more importantly, who? At that moment, David Ashford appeared in the study doorway. He looked haggard, as though he had not slept, and his eyes were red-rimmed from either tears or lack of rest, or perhaps both. He regarded Miss Marple and Anne with an expression that shifted rapidly from surprise to something more guarded. "Forgive me," he said. "I didn't realize anyone would be in here. I was looking for a document that Uncle Victor, had mentioned needing. I thought it might be on the desk." "How convenient," Miss Marple observed mildly, noting the way his eyes had shifted to the compass before returning to her face. "Tell me, David, did you have occasion to be in the S. 2D yesterday afternoon before dinner?" "No," David said quickly. "I only arrived at Thornfield at mid-afternoon. I went directly to my mother's sitting room, as Anne can probably confirm. I had no reason to enter the study." Anne nodded slowly, though something in her expression suggested uncertainty. Miss Marple watched David carefully, observing the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had clenched into fists at his sides, the careful control with which he maintained his composure. "Of course," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Forgive me for asking. It's simply that at my age one becomes rather too curious about details. A habit formed through years of village gossip, I'm afraid. Nothing of consequence. But..." As David left the study, Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Anne that suggested both of them understood something had shifted in their understanding of events. The compass had been moved, deliberately and deliberately hidden. And if David had not been in the study when Victor died, then someone else had been there. Someone who had reason to manipulate the scene, to perhaps conceal evidence of something that had happened immediately before Victor's heart had given way. The question now was not who had killed Victor Ashford, for no one had. The question was who had reason to disturb a dead man's final position, and what secret they had been attempting to hide. The evening meal was a subdued affair, served by Violet with mechanical efficiency, while the household members picked at their food with varying degrees of disinterest. Miss Marple observed each person present with renewed attention, her mind cataloguing expressions, silences, and the subtle ways in which people revealed their inner turmoil through seemingly insignificant gestures. Margaret ate little and spoke less. Her attention focused inward on concerns that clearly transcended the immediate tragedy. Avid appeared to be maintaining his composure through considerable effort, his hands steady but his eyes distant. Anne moved about the room like a ghost, her pale face even more colorless than usual. It was Mrs. Pemberton who provided the breakthrough, though she did so entirely without intention or awareness. As she served the dessert course, she made an offhand comment to Violet loud enough for those at the table to hear. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Pemberton said, "about when I found Mr. Ashford yesterday. I told the inspector I was cleaning the study around 4:30, but that wasn't quite right, was it? I went in around that time to see if the floors needed sweeping, but Mr. Ashford sent me away quite sharply. I didn't actually begin my proper cleaning until after 5 o'clock, when I thought he'd finished with his papers. That's when I found him." "Mother," Violet said quietly with a warning note in her voice. "What?" Mrs. Pemberton responded defensively. "It's hardly a secret now. The man is dead, and they've said it was natural causes. I'm just being honest about the timing." But Miss Marple had heard what Mrs. Pemberton had inadvertently revealed. Victor had been alive at 4:30, sending away the housekeeper. He had been dead by 5 o'clock when she returned. That was a window of only 30 minutes, and in that 30-minute interval, something had occurred that had prompted someone to move the compass. After dinner, Miss Marple requested a private word with Margaret in the small sitting room adjacent to the drawing room. She found her friend sitting in near darkness, the evening light having faded to twilight without Margaret having requested that lamps be lit. "Margaret," Miss Marple said gently, settling into the chair opposite, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me with complete honesty. When you threw the compass at Victor, approximately what time was that?" Margaret's head turned sharply toward her. "How did you—" "The timing, Margaret, please. It was shortly after 4 o'clock, perhaps 4:15. I left almost immediately after the altercation and went to my sitting room. I was there when David came to find me for our conversation about his financial situation. And you're quite certain you left Victor alive?" "Of course I left him alive," Margaret said, her voice rising with indignation. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting nothing at all," Miss Marple said calmly. "I'm simply establishing facts." Mrs. Pemberton left the study at approximately 4:30 after Victor sent her away. She returned at 5 o'clock and found him dead. During that half hour, someone moved the compass, someone who had reason to alter or conceal some detail of what had occurred. Margaret rose abruptly and moved to the window, her silhouette rigid against the fading light. "Then we're back where we started, aren't we? Back to suspicion and theory?" "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "We're much further along than that. You see, Margaret, when a person moves an object at a crime scene, or in this case, a death scene, they do so for a very specific reason. They move it because they were present at a crucial moment, and they wish to conceal that presence. They move it because they believe that moving the object will somehow change the story of what happened." "But Victor's death was natural," Margaret protested. "The doctor confirmed it." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But someone didn't know that. Someone came into the study, found Victor dead or dying, and panicked. That person moved the compass because they had been in the study immediately before Victor's collapse, and they wanted to ensure that no one would place them there at the moment of his death." Understanding dawned slowly on Margaret's face. "You think someone was with Victor when he had the heart attack?" "I think it's quite probable," Miss Marple said. "And I think that person had been in the study with Victor during those crucial minutes between 4:30 and 5 o'clock. I think that person had words with Victor, or had come to speak with him about something, and that the stress of that encounter may well have precipitated the heart attack. But who? Who would have gone to speak with Victor at that hour?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is what we must discover." The next morning brought a visitor to Thornfield Manor in the form of a solicitor named Mr. Blackwood, who had come to take statements regarding Victor's will and estate. It was during the course of his meeting with Margaret that the full picture began to emerge. Mr. Blackwood mentioned in passing that Victor had telephoned his office late yesterday afternoon, at approximately 4:45, to request an urgent appointment regarding changes to his will. The timing was specific. 4:45. 15 minutes after Margaret had left the study, 15 minutes into that crucial half-hour window, which meant Victor had been alive and functioning well enough to make telephone calls after Margaret's departure. Did he mention what those changes entailed? Miss Marple asked, positioning herself on the periphery of the conversation in a manner that suggested idle curiosity rather than investigative interest. He was rather vague, Mr. Blackwood admitted. He said he had had a change of perspective and wished to discuss certain provisions. He seemed quite agitated, actually. I suggested we meet this morning, but he insisted it be late yesterday afternoon. When I tried to arrange it, he became quite insistent, almost desperate. He said he needed to see me by 4 o'clock or not at all. By 4 o'clock, Margaret repeated. But surely it was after. Are 4 o'clock when he called? Actually, no, Mr. Blackwood said, consulting his notebook. According to my secretary's record, the call came through at 3:55. Mr. Ashford was quite specific about the timing. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the sequence of events to reorganize itself in her mind. Victor had called his solicitor at 3:55 to request an urgent meeting. Margaret had entered the study at 4 o'clock. They had argued about David. Margaret had thrown the compass and left. At 4:30, Mrs. Pemberton had found Victor still alive. At 5 o'clock, he was dead. But someone had moved the compass. Someone had been in that study during those crucial 30 minutes. Someone had a reason to conceal their presence. And Miss Marple finally understood who that someone was. Miss Marple excused herself from the conversation with Margaret and Mr. Blackwood on the pretext of fetching her reading glasses, and made her way instead to the library where Anne Hargrove was occupied with cataloguing correspondence. The young woman looked up from her work with evident surprise at the intrusion. "Anne, I wonder if you might help me with something," Miss Marple said, settling into the chair beside the desk, with the appearance of someone who had merely come to pass the time of day. "I've been thinking about the financial situation that David mentioned to his mother yesterday. He spoke of an investment opportunity that had come to him through an old friend in London. Do you happen to know anything about that arrangement?" Anne set down her pen carefully. "I'm not certain I should discuss David's private matters, Miss Marple." "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed readily, "though I confess I'm merely curious about the nature of the opportunity. Was it a business venture of some kind? A partnership? I believe it was something connected to." "Import and export," Anne said carefully. "David was quite secretive about the details, but I gathered it was a legitimate enterprise. He seemed rather hopeful about it." "And when did this opportunity present itself? Was it recent?" "He received the letter about it approximately 2 weeks ago," Anne said. "From someone named Robert Hartwell, I believe. David seemed quite excited when he told Margaret about it. He said Mr. Hartwell had been a friend from his time abroad and had recently returned to London to establish a business." Miss Marple stored this information carefully. 2 weeks ago would have been well before Victor's threats against David had crystallized into concrete action. Yet the timing suggested something else entirely. "One more question, Anne, if you would be so kind. Yesterday afternoon, when you were in Margaret's sitting room preparing the schedule, did you happen to see anyone moving about the corridor? Anyone who seemed particularly agitated or distressed?" Anne hesitated, her pale eyes reflecting uncertainty. "I'm not entirely sure. I heard footsteps in the corridor around 4:30. Someone moving quite quickly, actually. I remember thinking it was odd because the servants are usually more quiet about their movements. But I was focused on my work and didn't investigate. And you wouldn't know who those footsteps belonged to?" "No," Anne said quietly. "Though I did notice that when I came downstairs to help with preparations for dinner, David's room door was open, and his window was open as well, as though he'd just come in from outside." This detail sent a particular chill through Miss Marple's understanding of events. David's room, she recalled from her tour of the house upon arrival, overlooked the terrace and the gardens that connected to the east side of the manor, the same side where the study's secondary entrance was located. The door T hat opened directly onto the garden path. "Thank you, Anne," Miss Marple said, rising from her chair. "You've been most helpful." Miss Marple spent the next several hours in a state of profound contemplation, her knitting needles moving with automatic precision while her mind worked through the implications of what she had learned. The sequence of events was becoming increasingly clear, though the motive remained somewhat opaque. Victor had called his solicitor at 3:55, desperate to make changes to his will. Margaret had arrived at 4 o'clock and had confronted him about his threats toward David. They had argued, Margaret had thrown the compass, and she had left. But then, between 4:30 and 5 o'clock, someone else had entered the study, someone who had moved the compass, someone whose presence at that moment would create complications and suspicion. At 4 o'clock, Miss Marple realized David would have been alone in his room, presumably waiting for the financial details that would change everything. At 4:30, when Mrs. Pemberton had left the study, Victor had been alive but clearly in a state of considerable agitation. At 5 o'clock, he had been dead. The question was not whether David had killed Victor. The medical evidence was clear that Victor had died of a heart attack. The question was whether David had been present when that heart attack occurred, and if so, what had transpired between uncle and nephew in those final moments. Miss Marple requested an afternoon tea in the library, and when David appeared to join her, she gestured to him with the kind of gentle authority that had served her so well throughout her long life. "David, I wonder if you might sit with me for a moment," she said. "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." David looked immediately uncomfortable, his eyes darting toward the door as though calculating an escape route. "Miss Marple, I'm not certain this is appropriate. Anything you have to ask me, surely the inspector has concluded his investigation," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "And he has concluded quite correctly that your uncle died of natural causes. But there is a matter of truth that remains unresolved, and I believe you are the person best positioned to resolve it." "I don't know what you're talking about," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The compass on your uncle's desk was moved deliberately," Miss Marple said without preamble, "moved by someone who was in the study during those final moments of your uncle's life, someone who had come to speak with him about something of considerable importance, and who was present when his heart gave way." David's face had gone very pale. "You're wrong. I wasn't in the study." "No, not initially," Miss Marple agreed. "But I think you went there sometime after 4:30. I think you came down from your room through the garden, entering by the east door. I think you had heard, through servants' gossip, or through your mother's distress, that your uncle was in the study, and I think you felt compelled to speak with him about his threats. Even if that were true," David said quietly, "it wouldn't change anything. My uncle died of a heart attack, not because of anything I did." "No," Miss Marple said firmly, "but someone moved that compass to conceal your presence. And that someone was not you, which means there was a third person in the study yesterday afternoon, David. Someone who discovered you there with your uncle, or who arrived to find your uncle dead with you standing over him. Someone who panicked and tried to alter the scene." The color drained entirely from David's face. "You can't possibly—" "Who was it, David?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "Who was in the study with you when your uncle died?" For a long moment, David said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the name that Miss Marple had suspected since the moment Anne had described the footsteps in the corridor. "It was Anne," he said. "Anne moved the compass. Anne was the one who came into the study and found me there. She was the one who tried to protect me." The confession, once begun, came forth in a torrent of words that had been damming up behind Anne's careful composure for nearly 24 hours. Miss Marple listened with her characteristic patience, allowing the young woman to articulate the sequence of events without interruption, understanding that the telling itself was a form of necessary purification. "I'd been in the corridor," Anne explained, her pale hands trembling as she twisted them together. "I was bringing fresh flowers to Margaret's sitting room when I heard raised voices coming from the study. I recognized David's voice, and then his uncle's, and I became worried. David had been so distressed since returning home, and I knew his uncle had been threatening him with dreadful revelations. I thought perhaps there might be violence, so I lingered in the corridor." "And what did you hear?" Miss Marple prompted gently. At first, just angry words. David was telling his uncle that he had no right to use personal secrets as leverage, that such behavior was despicable. His uncle was responding with contempt, saying that David was weak and undeserving of the Ashford name. Then there was a terrible silence, and I heard a sound like someone gasping for breath. I became frightened and pushed the door open. Anne paused, her eyes distant with the memory. David was standing over his uncle. Mr. Ashford was on the floor, clutching at his chest, his face absolutely grey. David was trying to help him, trying to ease his suffering, but there was nothing. Anyone could do. I could see it immediately. The man was dying. His uncle was dying right there before us. "What did you do?" Miss Marple asked. "I panicked," Anne said simply. "I stood there, frozen, watching this man I had feared for so long gasping his last breaths. And then I looked at David, and I realized what it would look like. I realized that if anyone discovered David had been in that study during his uncle's final moments, everyone would assume he had caused it. They would say he had frightened his uncle deliberately, had perhaps even struck him. No one would believe that it was simply a terrible coincidence of timing. "So you moved the compass," Miss Marple said. "Yes. I knew the police would examine the room. I knew they would notice if things seemed disturbed. The compass was lying on the floor where David had tried to steady his uncle, and I realized it could place David at the scene. So I picked it up and put it back on the desk, but I was so agitated that I didn't notice I had reversed its direction. It wasn't until later that I realized my mistake." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You were attempting to protect someone you cared for." "I love him," Anne said quietly, without shame. "I have loved him since the moment he showed me kindness when no one else would. And when I realized that his uncle's death might be misinterpreted as something David had caused, I couldn't bear it. I had to try to protect him, even though my interference was clumsy and ultimately futile." "It was not futile," Miss Marple said gently. "Your actions, however well-intentioned, did not alter the truth of what occurred. Your uncle died of natural causes, David. The medical evidence is clear and incontrovertible. But what Anne did, what she risked by moving that compass and potentially implicating herself, speaks to the depth of her feeling for you." David, who had been silent, about Anne's confession, finally spoke. "I don't deserve such devotion. I came to the study with the intention of confronting my uncle, yes, but also with something darker in my heart. For a moment, when I saw him dying, I felt relief. I felt as though the problem that had haunted me since my return home was being solved by fate, rather than by any action of my own. And then I felt shame for feeling that relief, and I tried to help him, but by then it was far too late." Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of age, and she placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder. "You are human, David. Nothing more and nothing less. You felt relief at the removal of a threat, and then you felt appropriate shame for that natural emotion. That is not wickedness. That is conscience." The final confrontation took place in Margaret's presence, in the drawing room where the household assembled upon Miss Marple's quiet insistence. Inspector Thornton had been called back to Thornfield, as Miss Marple felt it necessary that the truth, however complex, be articulated to the proper authorities. The inspector listened with considerable skepticism as Miss Marple laid out the sequence of events, the movement of the compass, and the presence of both David and Anne in the study during those crucial final moments. "But the medical evidence is conclusive," the inspector protested. "Mr. Ashford died of natural causes. Even if young Mr. Ashford and the Hargrove girl were present, they cannot be charged with murder when no murder occurred." Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. They cannot be charged with anything really, except perhaps for interference with a death scene. And even that would be a difficult charge to sustain, given that neither of them actively concealed evidence so much as they attempted to remove themselves from suspicion through minor rearrangement of objects. "Then why bring me back here?" the inspector asked, clearly irritated. "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "the truth matters, Inspector. Not because it changes the legal circumstances, but because it illuminates the nature of human behavior, because it demonstrates how fear and love and desperation drive us to actions that seem logical in the moment, but become increasingly difficult to live with as time passes. Anne Hargrove moved that compass not from malice, but from devotion. David Ashford was present at his uncle's death, not through any design of his own, but through a tragic coincidence. And yet both of them will carry the weight of those moments for the rest of their lives. Margaret sat very still throughout this recitation, her hands folded in her lap. When Miss Marple had finished, she rose and moved to where Anne stood, her face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. "You risked your position, your reputation, everything," Margaret said to her companion. "You did so to protect my son. I don't know how to thank you for such loyalty." "You don't need to thank me," Anne said simply. "I would do it again." As the afternoon light faded and Inspector Thornton prepared to depart, Miss Marple found herself alone with Margaret in the study, standing before the mahogany desk where Victor Ashford had breathed his last. "Will they recover?" Miss Marple asked quietly, gesturing vaguely toward where David and Anne had withdrawn. "With time," Margaret said. "David has finally accepted that his past cannot be weaponized or hidden. Anne has learned that love sometimes requires us to act without certainty. And I have learned that the people we love are often far more resilient than we give them credit for being." Miss Marple picked up the compass and turned it gently until it pointed north once more, toward the window and the pale evening light beyond. "Human nature," she said softly, "is endlessly complex, isn't it? We spend our entire lives studying it, and still it manages to surprise us." "You've been a remarkable friend, Jane," Margaret said, embracing her. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "You would have managed," Miss Marple replied. "You would have discovered the truth eventually, as the truth always emerges, but I'm glad I could be of service." As Miss Marple returned to her room that evening to pack for her departure, she reflected that the greatest mystery was not the one involving Victor Ashford's death, but rather the infinite capacity of human beings to love one another despite their flaws and failures. The compass on the study desk would point north again, a symbol of order restored, but the lives it had briefly influenced would never return to their previous trajectory. They would move forward, altered and deepened by tragedy, carrying within them the knowledge of how fragile the boundaries between accident and intent truly were.